Well, okay. Well, are we ready to begin?
We're ready to begin.
Okay. Well, I'll start out by introducing myself. My name is Herbert Murez. I don't care how you pronounce it. I'm not sensitive about it. I was born July 2nd, 1923, so that makes me 98 years old in a few days. And I make I go through this in order that younger people should listen to it if possible and get some idea of the things that I learned the hard way by living through it. Because as one philosopher, whose name escapes me at the moment, an 18th or 19th century Spanish philosopher, who very wisely said that those who do not learn the lesson of history are fated to repeat them. So anyway, as I said, I was born in Vienna, in Austria, which was a very small country, and Vienna was a big city because originally it was the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that consisted of not less than 13 nationalities and had 56 million inhabitants. And after the World War I, all that was carved up into separate countries, and they all went their own way and all suffered their own fates. But anyway, that was Vienna, a city of some 2 million people, and barely a country of 6 to support that big a head and such a small body. So that was Vienna, and my family was a middle-class family. My parents had started a shoe store, and in time it became 2 shoe stores, and in time it became 3 shoe stores, and in time the 3 were consolidated into one big one. And anyway, that was Vienna. Times were bad, and the problem was a small country. There was not a lot of economic activity possible, so there was a pretty large population with very limited means of earning a living. And naturally, you have that type of population. They're open to all kinds of persuasions, which the Nazi Germans provided amply. So anyway, I had one characteristic, that I don't take to authority very easily. And that's been with me through life. And I went through public school, and in the way Austria was organized at the time, you didn't pick what happened to you. The supposed experts, the teachers, told you where you, because after that, the educational tracks divided. If you were academically inclined, they would either send you to a gymnasium, which is in terms of time or terms of age, it's the equivalent between 5th and 12th grade. Or they send you to what was known as a Landesschule, just to learn a trade, to become a butcher, a baker, or something, so you hopefully can make a living performing a trade. And I've always been good at taking exams, so I passed an exam to go to a gymnasium. And true to my nature, I didn't like the way the teaching went, because if you went to school in the United States, in all probability, the people who taught you were trying to get you to do some critical thinking, to learn how to think of your own, to get information and analyze it and figure out what follows from it. Well, that's not the way the system worked. They almost figuratively put a funnel into your ear and poured in all kinds of information, which you were supposed to absorb. And quantitatively, it was vast, probably much more than the high schools give you here. But again, there was one notable exception. The teacher, they called them professors at the time, the teacher who taught geography and history didn't believe in that system. He says, I don't care if you don't remember the place or the date of a battle, but I want you to understand the forces that came to a head and how one side won and one side lost and what happened as a result. I want you to understand the movement of powers and influences. He happened to be one of the few Jewish professors, and of course when the Anschluss happened, Anschluss is a German word, means annexation of Austria to Germany. When that happened, he was thrown out of school. Anyway,
That's too bad.
so that brings me to the time when, in March of 1938, when the Germans took over Austria. And I remember, and I saw this with my own eyes, how the trucks of German troops rolled into the city of Vienna, and they were sitting there with their steel helmets, holding their rifles with the bayonets, and believe it or not, the population stood by the side of the street of the main road on which these trucks drove in, and they cheered. Because they thought things will get better. The ground has been prepared for that type of attitude. Anyway,
And how old were you at this point?
when I was around 13, and that happened in March of 1938, and in May of 1938, all Jewish students were thrown out of school. They didn't care to finish they didn't let you finish the class, didn't finish anything, out you go, that's all.
Yeah.
So I dealt with what faced me, which is my parents, of course. I said they had the shoe store, and they were persecuted immediately because the Nazis took some white paint and soap and smeared up all the windows. And I can show you a picture of the store. It was a beautiful store. And then they put a uniformed guard in front of the door just to make sure that no Aryans, no non-Jews enter. And the way the system worked is it was designed to cleanse Jews of their possessions and but to maintain an air of legality. So, for example, there was a man, his name was Ernest Mocrae, who took over my parents' store. And an agreement was drawn up by an attorney, naturally a non-Jewish attorney who was well deserving of the Nazi Party, who had to get paid for it, who drew an agreement that everybody agrees on a purchase price that was roughly the equivalent of maybe 5% of the value of the inventory and nothing for the fixtures and so forth. and an assignment of leasehold, a long-term leasehold that was necessary to maintain a good store. Anyway, and now here comes the kicker. That the money was not to be paid immediately. It was to be paid in installments. And those installments were not payable to my parents. They were payable into an account that was blocked. They could not withdraw 1 red cent. Later on, the Germans levied a fine on all Jewish accounts called the Judenbuße, and that wiped out the account. So they never saw penny one for what they spent their professional lives in building up. And you may have heard about the Kristallnacht. This happened in November of 1938. There was a somewhat demented Jewish refugee from Poland who had lived in Paris. He was demented and mentally disturbed, and he took a pot shot at one of the secretaries of the German embassy. And the Germans, the Nazi Party, was well organized to make the reaction appear to be a spontaneous outpouring of anger. So that day, as I mentioned, that day I had to go to an office to get a piece of paper. As I said, that drew you through a knothole in the papers that you needed, and make sure that, first of all, you're cleansed, second, you got a place to get out. So anyway, I get to the place, which was in the center of Old Vienna, where the street was a little wider than an alley. 2 cars could not have passed. And normally there were people milling around. On that day, absolutely nothing. It was in the early morning. I was dumbfounded. But by that time, I was already in, and there was in the street. But there was an SS man waiting at the guard in the black boots and the black uniform and all of the regalia of the SS. And I saw immediately that something was amiss. So I said, "Excuse me, sir, can you tell me where's this and that office?" Well, he didn't answer me directly, but asked me, "How old are you?" Well, I knew that it didn't sound good, so I made myself a little younger. I told him, "I'm 13, I was 14. So at that point in the conversation, somebody out of one of the windows, on the windows, called out to him, and he turned his head. And instinctively, I cannot say that this was planned or considered, but instinctively, I started to run to get out of there. And I ran through all the old streets, which were little more than alleys, back and forth and sideways. And by the time I was out of breath, my breath was a lot better in those days than it is today. By the time I was out of breath and stopped, I looked, nobody was following me. At least nobody I could identify. And I made it very carefully back through side streets to go back home. And of course, and before this was the so-called Kristallnacht. Found out later that people who went to that office were detained, sent to a concentration camp. Some came back, some didn't. And I said, my parents' efforts, they were being cleansed of their store and their livelihood. And you were confronted with 2 requirements. First of all, you knew you had to get out. because there was no future, no even presence there.
Yeah.
Second, you had to find some place to get in. And the world at that point cried crocodile's tears. We're sorry for all you refugees. We'd love to help you, but we have an unemployment problem of our own. So there were some notable exceptions. England did probably more than any of the major countries in taking in people. And if you talk to my good dear friend Hilda, she'll tell you how she went on one of the transports that rescued children by bringing them to England. Anyway, my father unfortunately suffered a nervous breakdown and he became non-functional. So my mother had to do everything, and she was a giant. She did everything. She saw to it. She saw to it that we find some relatives in the United States, or any place for that matter, that you have a place to go to. And she did, after a lot of failed attempts, find a distant relative of my father, and I'll explain the relationship. My father was a child of his father, of course, and he became a widower because his wife died. And he married a lady who was a widow of her first marriage and had children of that marriage. So the uncle that we located, we call him Uncle, he lived in Los Angeles, he was the husband of one of those children, one of those girls.
I think I got that.
Yeah. So that was the relationship. Anyway, the immigration law at the time was such that you had to have, first of all, you had to have a quota number. And every country had a quota based on how many people of the nationality of that country were part of the American population at the time. So the biggest quota, of course, was for the British Isles, England, Ireland, and there were no emigrations from either of those countries at the time. The countries that had smaller quotas and were very much overloaded were the Eastern European countries. And my father was born in a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that became Poland after World War I, and accordingly he was given the Polish quota, which was overloaded.
Yeah.
And my mother somehow was on the Russian quota because her family lived on the border between Austro-Hungary and Russia, and the family was lived on the Austrian side because that was less oppressive, but somehow she got onto the Russian quota, and that was just about equally overloaded. So you had to wait for your quota number, and you also had to have an affidavit of support from an American citizen, wherein an American citizen undertook that you would not become a public charge. And Uncle Ted, God bless he's not with us anymore, but God bless his memory, gave us that affidavit. And first, my brother's quota number came up, and he left, and I came after him about a month. And I remember that my mother took me to the railway station, and she acted as though I was going away on a summer fling, because it was getting March, so it was already getting a little better climate. Anyway, my mother acted, she kept a stiff upper lip, God bless her, and didn't want to, it was a situation in which we knew we might not see each other again. So I went from Vienna by train through Germany and came to the Dutch border. There, German guards came in, and first of all, you were allowed to carry one suitcase, no valuables, just clothes and toilet articles and things of that sort. So they came in, they took my suitcase that had been carefully packed, dumped it out to see that there's nothing wrong. My passport, of which I will show you a page later on, that had the J stamped on it. The red J meant if you have a passport with a red J, the legend said this is good for a one-time only exit from Germany, nothing else. So they said, well, we want your papers, we'll be back. So it took about 20 minutes, and I don't mind telling you, those were the longest 20 minutes of my life. Finally, the guards came back and they threw the papers at me. Okay, you're okay. And they had noted something on the last page. And then the train went into Holland. That was before the war broke out, before Holland was occupied, and actually it pulled up almost by the side of the wharf, because I could take my suitcase and walk from the train to the boat, which was docked there. It was a small 10,000 ton ship of Dutch registry, and it took for that ship 10 days to make it to New York. So I made it to New York, and in New York I knew of two distant relatives. One of them was a very old lady, Jane Marco, who lived on a pitiful pension in a basement apartment, but she put me up on her living room couch for a couple of days. The other relatives, Willie Marco, was an interesting character. During the day, he spent his day on the New York Stock Exchange. He had a seat there. And at nighttime, he went to the Bowery, which is one of the lesser quality places in New York, and he collected the rents from the flop houses. Well, I contacted Willie Marco, and I asked him, I'd like to come and see you. So he told me his office address, and I went there, and we spoke for a few minutes. He says, okay, that's fine, that's very interesting. And he took me back down to the subway. He put a nickel in the slot. It took a nickel in those days to ride the New York subway. So he put a nickel in the slot and sent me back to Jane. And after that, I couldn't get past his secretaries. I called, he's out, he's not available, what have you, leave a message, fine. Anyway, I traveled on the Greyhound bus from New York to Los Angeles. That took 5 days.
Wow.
And I got to Los Angeles, and my Uncle Ted met me at the bus station, and he put me up. And I got there on a Friday night. Then on Monday morning, he took me down to his factory. He had a garment factory, and where he was making various garments, and he put me to work. I should have gone to school, but things were not all that organized or enforced in those days. So he put me to work, and he paid me $10 a week for my work, not of 40 hours, but more like 70 hours. Anyway, and out of that $10, he took $5 for room and board. And I'm very thankful to him for having done so, because I felt I was paying my own way and I wasn't getting any charity. So for a time that went on, and I saw that this was a blind alley, this factory. And I started to look for other higher jobs. And in the garment business, I don't know if you've ever seen how garments are manufactured industrially. They're piling cloth about this high, and then they take a machine, which actually is a knife, that goes up and down at a fast pace, and they push it through the cutout, the forms, and they bundle the pieces, and the machine operator sew it up, and that's the clothing. That's how it's done industrially. Anyway, so I learned how to push that knife. Nobody gives you a chance to do that, because one wrong move, you caused a lot of damage. So I had to lie. And I found out one thing, that in this world, you can't be too modest about your qualifications. I learned that lesson fairly early. And at this point, I will fast forward to Pearl Harbor. And actually, I was listening on the radio, and I remember the announcer screaming at the top of his voice, "This is not a play, this is not a game, this is not a drill, this is the real thing." And of course, after Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. And at first, they didn't like me. They didn't want me, because I had a heart murmur and I had flat feet, and they were looking for perfect specimen, which I was not then and I'm not now. And first time, so they didn't want me. The second time, they didn't want me. The third time, apparently my heart murmur got a lot better and my flat feet strengthened, because they took me. And they sent me to Camp Crowder in Missouri, in the Ozarks, for basic training in the Signal Corps. Well, I just got started with that basic training. The company clerk called me, "Murez, come on down." So they loaded me on a truck with about 3 other men, drove me down to the courthouse, went before the judge. The judge says, "Raise your right hand." So I raised my right hand. "You swear, blah, 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 blah." Yeah, so you became a citizen. And you got back on the truck, and I got a naturalization certificate that shows me in my Army fatigues, dirty, grumpy. And I'm very proud of that certificate. Anyway, about a month, maybe even less than a month later, "Murez, come on down to the office." So I came on down. "You're being transferred to Camp Ritchie in Maryland." Now, by now you may know about Camp Ritchie, because lately there was a segment on the 60-minute program, a very popular program, that showed a little bit of Camp Ritchie. It was the United States Army Military Intelligence School. And I assure you that there is no relationship between mental intelligence and military intelligence. Those are different species. Actually, the term derives from older usage, meaning information. specifically information about the adversary. And so they had various courses to train you. And of course, they were an odd assortment of people going through these courses. Most importantly, they had foreign language capabilities. I was fluent in German, and perhaps the majority of the students were either refugees from Germany or from Austria that got out similarly to how I had. They also had a bunch of Russian speakers, and they had a bunch of Japanese speakers. Some of them not Japanese. Some of them were Occidental people, but they had lived in Japan or they had traveled in Japan or knew something. So they had a course for them. And after analyzing my training that I had, which was virtually nothing, they stuck me into a course for documents translators, because it was already after the invasion of the Normandy landing, and the documents that you captured were of two kinds. One had immediate tactical effect, and those were of interest to people who were trained for prisoner of war examination. And that is the part that you saw if you saw the piece on 60 Minutes. Documents analysis was more directed towards strategic things like operational plans and so forth. Remember, those were days when everything had to be on paper.
Yeah.
So anyway, I got into a course, learned to learn about the German army organization, the Nazi Party organization, the German government organization, how they were all interwoven, and it was necessary to be able to understand these documents. For one thing, they were full of abbreviation. Unless you know what the abbreviations were, you couldn't make it. Anyway, I remember one incident from the class that I was in. You were seated in classrooms pretty much like a high school classroom looks like. And the Army in those days had a practice, which I think they still follow, and it is followed by major corporations, that they try to spot the comers and to circulate them through the organization to become familiar with the whole operation. So I had sitting next to me a colonel from Fort Benning, Georgia, the General Staff School. And that colonel unashamedly looked over my shoulder and copied my papers.
Smart man. Smart man.
And the instructor, a sergeant, was wise enough to the ways of the Army not to see anything. He could see nothing to even stop him or anything. Anyway, I graduated from that class. I got a sheepskin, and I was sent to Baltimore, and there we went. We were put with a whole bunch of other people on a ship that during the peacetime had been the SS Normandy, the French competition with the Queen Mary. And of course that ship had been emptied out, cleaned out completely to have layers and layers and layers of bunks and minimal, and I do say minimal, toilet facilities and a galley where you could go and eat. Never mind whether you were hungry or not. You ate when your turn came, and that's it. Anyway, that ship had about 25,000 soldiers on it. And it was destined to go to Bristol in England, in southern England, and from there then we were supposed to go across the channel. Anyway, I was standing on the after deck, on the hind deck, and I see the ship is going not east but west. You could tell by the sun and so forth. And I found out what was, after a while, one of the crewmen told us that they had spotted a U-boat and they had to avoid them. Anyway, and that little side trip naturally took a lot of fuel, so the ship put in at Liverpool in Scotland, which was perhaps 200 miles closer. So from Scotland, I went on a boat, not on a boat, excuse me, I went on a railway carriage down to Bristol, and in Bristol I went on some rusty old tub that must have been already ancient in Nelson's day. And that was also just a hull that had been emptied out, and it just bunk, 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 and that was it. So I didn't like that. So I stayed on the deck. I went into a lifeboat because I figured if this boat is attacked by a U-boat, it takes only one torpedo, and you have 1,000 casualties drowning like rats because there was one little steel ladder, and how many people could get up there before the boat sank. Anyway, so I stayed on top of the deck, and I've never been so cold in all my life, but during the night the ship crossed over into Le Havre, which had just been liberated. And from Le Havre, as soon as I was actually unassigned to SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which was the General Eisenhower's command. So from there, they sent me to Paris, and then I had an interesting military experience. No sooner did I get to Paris, after about 2 days, a captain comes looking for me. "You Herbert Murez?" "Yeah, come with me." Okay. So find out that that captain and 4 enlisted men, all of whom spoke German, could speak it fluently, and were trained in documents analysis. Got 2 jeeps, military orders, cans full of gasoline, enough rations for a few days, and off we went to follow in the tracks of General Patton's Third Army, which had punched a hole in the German line, to actually go through Bohemia and into Saxony. The destination was a location where the Germans had hollowed out a mountain and had a slave labor factory inside, and they had hollowed out the mountain because that was protection against Allied bombings. The bombs couldn't penetrate. And we saw those plans. They were all rolled up papers and so forth, and they had all kinds of markings on them that looked like hieroglyphics, but I could see something that suggested a trajectory, and so we knew this had something to do with artillery or rocketry. And we hightailed back to Paris as quickly as we could, the whole trip. If you look at the map, you see this is a pretty good distance. The whole trip took 3 days with a turnaround because there was no sleeping. And the reason for it was it was known at that point that the location where those plans were found by Third Army personnel, that was to be turned over to the Russians, as there had been inter-allied agreements in how Germany was going to be carved up into 4 zones of occupation, and this was going to be part of the Russian zone. Anyway, and the Third Army people who found that thought, whatever it is, we better keep that. And so we brought this back to Paris, and a couple of days later, that captain bumped into me and said, those were plans for the V-2 rockets, which the Germans had perfected to fire from Germany over the whatever part of territory they had, and they landed in London and caused all kinds of havoc. It was something that Hitler had counted on to turn the fortunes of the war, but it was too little and too late for him, thank God. Anyway, then I was in Paris for about roughly a week, and the Germans surrendered. And I remember that scene, and I've never seen anything like it. I don't expect to. There was public jubilation in the streets of Paris. Wherever you went, somebody showed up with an accordion. You know, these are things that are very common in Europe, that you push the bellows and play the keys with your fingers, make a little music. They were dancing, and if you wore an American uniform, you were very welcome.
Wow.
And anyway, after that, I was assigned to a unit that was a mixed English-American unit, and was known as the 3669 Berlin Document Center. The task of this unit that consisted of about 30 or 40 Englishmen and maybe 110 or 120 Americans, a few officers and mostly enlisted people who knew something about not only language but the organization of the army, the Nazi Party, and everything. And I had 2 jobs that were interesting. Some of them meant going through captured German army documents. And there were some who were hand-signed by Adolf Hitler, a very characteristic signature that I would recognize instantly. And of those that were hand-signed by Hitler, there's one that stands out in my mind and memory, which is the field order for the occupation of the Rhineland. You may be aware that under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was allowed to keep any troops west of the Rhine. And that was, of course, a claw in Hitler's gullet, and he wanted to occupy the Rhineland because he had long-term ambitions where this was the very first step. So the order read, and this is an almost exact translation, if any resistance is encountered on the part of French military forces, there are to be no military engagement, but you turn around immediately and go back whence you came. Well, that of course was not known at the time, because when the Germans moved, the French were ready to mobilize. And the English didn't want to mobilize because they had very bad economic conditions at the time. And I think also the disturbances surrounding Edward VIII and his marriage that didn't agree with royal protocol, and England at that point, the English government took the position, the war is over, we've got our own problems, we have our own unemployed, let them have it. So nothing happened, and Hitler got away with it. And to my mind, the lesson that he derived from it is that there is no will to resist. And what follows is history. He found out that the West really was more concerned with immediate discomfort than long-term resistance to life-threatening evil. And when I speak to school children, I point out to them that the wrong choice was made at that time, and that you'll never go wrong by resisting evil, but you'll go wrong by not resisting it. Anyway, I also knew that I had a lot of family that had been sent into concentration camps, and my father's old uncle somehow had been sent to Theresienstadt, and somehow as an old person that needed hardly any food, that nobody paid any attention to, he survived. And I located him through the Red Cross at that time. And mind you, this was in the days before computers. They literally had millions of people, what they called displaced persons, who had been shanghaied by the Germans to put to work, or sent into concentration camps, or otherwise gathered up from their normal home places, and they were walking the roads. There were no railroads. There was no transportation. There were no trucks, no nothing. They had to walk it to get back home. So they were walking on the streets, and that I remember at that time, we saw them always walking on the highways, and we had a practice in our mess hall. Give them what they want when they want. The colonel, the boss of the outfit, he looked the other way because it was not permitted, but he looked the other way, for which I give him credit. And I do remember that these people that came out of a concentration camp, they were more flesh and bone, and more skin and bones than fresh, but they pulled themselves along on the street. And when they came to our mess hall, we gave them what they wanted. And they started, I saw them look around whether somebody's watching, take a piece of bread and stick it into the pocket, because they were conditioned to look out, to protect for something to eat, because you didn't know where your next meal or edible stuff would come from anyway. Also, while I was in Berlin, I had something to do with overseeing a detail of Germans, workers that we had hired, to sort out cards, file cards about roughly the size of an 8.5 by 11 page, file cards on which the Nazi Party kept our personal membership records and awards and so forth. Because every German that you spoke to at the time, I was not a Nazi, I didn't know what was going on, nobody told me, I had no idea. I had nothing to do with it. Well, these were millions of file cards, which in the waning days of the war in Europe had been dumped into an old salt mine, and they were waterlogged. But I don't know, some Navy diver or somebody brought them back up, and we dried them out, and they had to be resorted and alphabetized and deciphered and what have you. And by that time, then I had a chance to travel to Vienna to see what was going on. I went to our old apartment, and I showed up there in my army uniform, and the people that lived there thought I was going to throw them out.
Oh, wow.
I had neither the power nor the intention to do so, but it was interesting. And through the Red Cross, I had located my father's uncle, who was actually on his last thread of a life. And when I walked into his room, he was in bed. He couldn't sit up. When I walked in his room, "Ja, das ist der Herbert." He recognized me. Apparently the Red Cross must have alerted him that I was looking for him, because I had given the Red Cross all the names that I could think of and connections to permit locating people if they were still alive. Anyway, what I did then is I took my duffel bag. You know what those military duffel bags are like? And I picked up rations, and I filled it up. And I brought it back to my uncle and left it with him. And then I went back to Berlin, and by that time, they sent me back to my time was up. My number for repatriation had come up, and so they sent me back to the United States. It was an interesting trip. I was traveling on a train from Berlin to Bremerhaven, which was a seaport from which ships went back to the U.S. to carry troops back home. And they had the locomotive was an old-fashioned coal-fired locomotive, and I got a cinder in my eye because the windows were open and all kinds of crud blew in. Anyway, and I had one choice of either to get off the boat, go to an army hospital, have them pull it out, or try to get onto the ship and hope that there's somebody there who can do it. In the meantime, the eye hurt like hell. And there was a fellow next to me who said, "I'm a mule skinner from Arkansas." And we did that all the time with the mules. And he took a pencil and turned my eyelid upside down and took a handkerchief, swiped it, and out it was. Which was not a very medically approved method, but it worked. So I didn't have to get off the boat. And I went back, and I was discharged in Fort Dix in New Jersey. I should have been discharged at Fort MacArthur in California, but that was done accidentally on purpose so I could collect travel pay from Fort Dix to better than traveling on a military plane, and I had enough of locomotive-pulled trains. So that's my military career. And eventually I became so dissatisfied with myself because I wasn't getting any place. And the Army, or the Veterans Administration rather, at that time had a program of running people through a process of analyzing their educational development and aptitude. It was a 3-day test. I'd never in my life, as I said, I never went to school here. I never in my life took a true, false, or multiple choice test. All I ever did was essay. Anyway, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. These are very easy because when you look at it, you know immediately which makes sense and which doesn't. So they gave me the equivalent of 3 years of college, which I didn't have, not anywhere near, but they gave it to me. And for occupation, they said, there are only 2 occupations for you. And they were being either a journalist or a lawyer. And as between those 2, I chose being a lawyer. And whoever analyzed my profile picked up the fact that I don't cater to authority. And those are 2 professions in which you oppose authority. And it is the beauty of our system that you can do it lawfully and still be a good citizen. Anyway, that's how I got to be a lawyer, and in time I retired, and here I am.